60% of Americans believe that guns will make them safer. In our previous video on defensive gun use, we talked about why the research that fuels that myth is flawed. If you haven't watched that video, we suggest you watch it first to learn how to effectively refute the myth. In this video, we'll take a deeper dive into common counter-arguments so that you are ready to spread awareness about the truth. Guns don't make us safer. First, we're going to explore how false positives and false negatives impact research. Just a reminder, a false positive is when a person claims to have experienced a defensive gun use in order to sound heroic or to justify their use of firearms, when, in fact, their defensive gun use was not legal or legitimate, or they made up their experience. A false negative, on the other hand, is when a person denies having experienced a defensive gun use, when in reality they did. Maybe they used an illegally owned gun, or the defensive gun use was criminal versus criminal, or the respondent is concerned that the government might find out they have guns if they report a defensive gun use. In short, more false positives lead a survey to overestimate defensive gun uses, while more false negatives result in the survey underestimating defensive gun uses. In response to past criticism of his work, researcher Gary Kleck, whose research estimates there are 2.5 million defensive gun uses annually, has argued that it is more realistic to assume that false negatives outweigh false positives, and believes that his surveys actually underestimate the true numbers of defensive gun use. Yet Kleck's defense commits what is called the base rate fallacy, which means he ignores the relative numbers of people who have and/or haven't experienced a defensive gun use. Given the statistical rarity of defensive gun uses, remember, even according to the highest possible estimate, less than 2% of the population has experienced a defensive gun use annually. There are far more people who haven't had a defensive gun use than have had one. This means there are far more people who can falsely claim they had a defensive gun use even though they didn't, than people who can falsely claim they didn't have a defensive gun use but in fact did. As a result, false positives will almost always outweigh false negatives. In fact, Kleck's own defense requires assuming a false negative rate 135 times larger than the false positive rate, a disparity that has no rational basis. Let's break this down with a closer look at the survey data. Gary Kleck's largest survey on defensive gun use had 5,000 respondents, of whom 66 indicated they had a defensive gun use in the past year. These 66 individuals represented 1.32% of the sample, which, when extrapolated to the U.S. population when the survey was conducted, indicated approximately 2.5 million defensive gun uses annually. On the other hand, the Gun Violence Archive tracks verified defensive gun uses through more than 7,500 police and media sources, and finds approximately 2,000 incidents annually. Using the Gun Violence Archive's data, a perfectly accurate survey of 5,000 individuals would find that none of the respondents would likely report a defensive gun use, or one at the very most. Yet no survey is perfectly accurate, and will always suffer from some false positives and negatives. Given that there would likely be no respondents that would have experienced a defensive gun use in the past year, any inaccurate responses are going to result in false positives. In fact, Kleck's 2.5 million defensive gun use number can be entirely explained by a false positive rate of slightly more than 1%. By typical survey standards, an error rate this small would be seen as very accurate. Yet, due to the inherent false positive problem that arises in surveys of statistically rare events, this small error rate creates a massive overestimation. Let's review Kleck's study from a different angle. According to Kleck's findings, half of his survey respondents reported their defensive gun uses to the police. This would mean that 1.25 million defensive gun uses were reported. Yet the Gun Violence Archive found just under 1,600 reported defensive gun uses in 2019, nearly 1/1000th of Kleck's estimate. Said differently, the Gun Violence Archive would have had to miss 99.94% of the annual reported defensive gun uses for Kleck's estimate to be correct. Unless police reports miss more than 99.9% of defensive gun uses, the theory that defensive gun uses are widespread lacks any empirical support. And again, the implication of not reporting a defensive gun use is either irresponsible or criminal. Another counterargument you hear often from gun advocates is from a Centers for Disease Control and Prevention study commissioned in 2013 at the direction of the Obama White House. As the gun lobby selectively quotes from the study, almost all national survey estimates indicate that defensive gun uses by victims are at least as common as offensive uses by criminals, with estimates of annual uses ranging from about 500,000 to more than 3 million in the context of about 300,000 violent crimes involving firearms in 2008. But the following two sentences are ignored. On the other hand, some scholars point to a radically lower estimate of only 108,000 annual defensive uses based on the National Crime Victimization Survey. The variation in these numbers remains a controversy in the field. It's important to note a few more problems with this talking point. One, the CDC study is neither a study nor from the CDC. Rather, it's a review of the literature published by the Institute of Medicine and National Research Council. Its purpose was to highlight aspects of gun violence that need further study. 2. One of the authors of the paper is Gary Kleck, who cites his own flawed survey. The report fails to mention this bias. 3. The defensive gun use section is not new research, but is merely citing existing flawed research. Citing flawed research doesn't make it any less flawed. 4. The report was written in 2013, a year before the Gun Violence Archive began compiling data. Empirical data is more reliable than survey data, particularly when the survey data in question has glaring flaws. The gun lobby continues to return to the narrative that the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, but this is simply not true. In fact, FBI reports of active shooter incidents find that unarmed civilians stop more active shooters than armed civilians. Take the 2011 Tucson shooting, for example. When the shooter dropped his magazine, one bystander grabbed it, a second battled him with a folding chair, and a third, a 74-year-old retired colonel, tackled him to the ground. When a gun-carrying civilian finally arrived on the scene, not only did he arrive too late, but he almost shot the wrong person. In an interview afterwards, he admitted that he was really lucky to not have pulled the trigger. The facts are clear. Guns just don't make us safer. Help us spread the word by sharing this video. Visit www.gvpedia.org to learn more.